Gendo Ikari in Neon Genesis Evangelion is incredibly enigmatic. There's no actual one singular consensus on what he had planned throughout the series. We know he wanted to reunite with Yui, but whether he wanted that by merging all humans or just putting himself in the Eva or putting humanity in the Eva is more contentious. However, I do think there is one definitive answer, and I want to establish that before moving on to the deeper analysis. I'm 100% certain that he had a human instrumentality planned. We know this because when he was trying to activate Third Impact, he asked Rei to merge all souls into one, and when Shinji activated instrumentality, he said that he finally got what he wanted. There is also the fact that in episode 25 of the TV series, if you consider that episode canon, he outright rejects the idea of instrumentality being nothingness and insists that it's actually peace. Of course, this begs a question. Why did Gendo and Seal compete for control over Third Impact if they had the same end goal? You can boil it down to trust issues, but that's kind of lame. I think a more simple explanation comes down to their differing motives. Gendo wants to reunite with Yui. As such, he needs Yuna 1 protected since it contains her soul. This is why Gendo throws away the lance in episode 22. This makes Seal want to use Yuna 1 as their Lilith substitute since they don't have the lance to control Lilith anymore. Now that Gendo has made Unit 1 crucial to Seal's plans, they can ensure its protection. Unit 0 and Unit 2 were both destroyed at some point, so clearly Unit 1 also had a decent chance of being destroyed. This also explains why Gendo keeps opposing Seal even after this point. His control mechanism over Lilith is Rei, but Seal wants to use the duplicate pseudo-lances on Unit 1 the way they wanted to use the powerful real one on Lilith. We can surmise that if Unit 1 was actually lanced by Seal, something would have happened to Yui's soul that Gendo wouldn't want. This is why Gendo would rather do instrumentality his own way using Rei, since doing it Seal's way would involve messing up his whole reason for doing this. So case closed, seems pretty cut and dry, right? Gendo wanted to do human instrumentality. I think it is, but I also think the reason why people have differing interpretations on this is because of two things. First of all, there's the video game, which has a bunch of new lore. Gendo has some other weird plan of putting people into the Evas and then having them return after Third Impact. Personally though, I don't place any stock in this game. I think this series should and can stand on its own. Some of the game's lore is contradictory to the series despite Gainax advising it, and there's no way to know how much the game developers took their own liberties in crafting the lore. So I think it's fine to set that aside. However, the other reason why we see differing interpretations in Gendo's plan is because of this incredibly bizarre conversation between Gendo and Seal in End of Evangelion. Basically, Gendo argues with Seal and alludes to wanting to store humanity in the Evas and use them as arcs, which we know from later in the movie involves saving humanity from Third Impact. This conversation is so confusing because it contradicts every moment we see in the series, which very clearly points to Gendo wanting to merge all of humanity. In fact, we know this isn't some oversight by the creators because just 20 minutes later we see Gendo asking Rei to merge everyone. Matter of fact, Gendo even says in this conversation, "Death produces nothing," in response to Seal wanting instrumentality. This is incredibly out of character considering in episode 12 of the series, Gendo speaks positively of the barren, humanless Antarctica and calls it a pure world free of sin. This matches perfectly with how Gendo in episode 25 says instrumentality is peace. So clearly he's bluffing to Seal, right? He's claiming something that isn't his plan is his plan, and he's talking to a group of people he's been lying to throughout the series. But the question is why? What does he gain from lying, and what is the narrative purpose of this scene? Well, first of all, I don't think it's fully a bluff. If you take a lot of what he says out of context, they match perfectly with his ideals. For example, he says death produces nothing. In the context of the conversation, this is a lie because he's saying this to rebuke instrumentality. But it's also true to some extent because of how he frames it differently from Seal. He sees death as a negative and he simply does not view instrumentality as death. That's why he rejects the idea of it being nothingness in episode 25. He also says that the Eva series will advance humanity to a new world, and again, Gendo does genuinely believe this. The mass production Evas did end up being a key part of instrumentality, and he also does see instrumentality as achieving godhood in episode 21. So while he is being disingenuous throughout the conversation by trying to have Seal think he wants to store humanity in the arcs, it's more so a lie by omission rather than a straight up fabrication. It's also worth noting that it's entirely plausible that Gendo and Fuyutsuki did plan on storing humanity in the arcs at one point. In episode 21's flashback, when he first shows Fuyutsuki the Eva, he says that they'll use the Evas to bring mankind to a new era. Further evidence is that we know their plan here contradicts Seal's, since we know Seal was going after Yui. Of course, this is before Yui puts her soul in the Eva, which causes Gendo to pivot to human instrumentality. So the fact that Gendo and Fuyutsuki had once held the ARC plan makes it the perfect bluff to Seal, since Seal likely already suspected that at one point. Now we're left with a question. What is the purpose of Gendo trying to mislead Seal here? Well, consider that this is after Gendo made its treason clear by sabotaging Seal's plan and throwing the lance so that they can become reliant on Unit 1. He does not want them to know that he did that in order to protect Unit 1, so the best thing to say at this point is that he simply wants to use Unit 1 and the other Evas in order to store humanity in the arcs. After all, if they learn that he did all that because he wants the soul inside Unit 1 to be protected, then it's entirely likely that they'll try to lance Unit 1 as soon as possible so that Gendo's plan can be nullified. This lie is basically just a minor safety measure he took so that Seal doesn't learn of his weakness. What's interesting though is that this lie seems to be more in line with Fuyutsuki's ideals. That's why his response to the whole thing is bringing up humanity's persistence and how that persistence is the reason why Yui stayed in the Eva. In fact, Fuyutsuki in general seems to embody Yui's ideals, specifically her life-affirming ideals concerning humanity finding paradise within hell. That's why in the Antarctica scene, Fuyutsuki disagrees with Gendo's point of view that a barren land is pure, instead opting for a more humanistic perspective where he prefers the presence of humans, even if they have sinned. Sounds very Yui-esque to me. This goes even further when you consider that Fuyutsuki was in on Yui's plan the whole time. More specifically, her guiding the whole series so that Shinji and humanity can learn from their mistakes and work to improve themselves, and she becomes humanity's monument in space. This tracks perfectly with how negatively Fuyutsuki talks about instrumentality in End of Eva, describing it as devilish. By contrast, Gendo appears to have abandoned Yui's ideals due to the trauma of losing her. He initially accepts her more optimistic ideas by having the ARC plan and by accepting her hopeful reasoning for having Shinji, but it's after losing her that he switches over to the instrumentality plan. This explains his disagreement with Fuyutsuki in the Antarctica scene. It's basically Gendo disagreeing with a past version of himself. This divide in ideologies is made clearer through Gendo's attempts at godhood. He describes instrumentality as godhood in episode 21. In the Antarctica scene, Gendo arrogantly praises humanity's scientific evolution, which caused the area to be so barren, and he also wanted to be God on a literal level since his plan involves fusing with Rei and Lilith. Similarly, Seal also seeks to attain godhood through human instrumentality. They want humanity to fuse with God and become a higher life form. The show as a whole condemns the attempt to reach godhood because it's an attempt to be inhuman. It's an attempt to separate yourself from the troubles of human connection and try to rise above that. It's just another form of escapism. This is why we see the same action framed in so many different ways. Gendo sees instrumentality as peace, Seal sees it as evolution, and Shinji sees it as suicide. This differing framing is important to Gendo's conflict with Seal, but it also shows how so many seemingly various motivations are ultimately just rationalizing a more universal and fundamental desire to escape from it all. As we know, Yui reprimands Gendo for this, including his abandonment of Shinji. I personally think Gendo felt guilty about this to some degree. That's why he made Rei Shinji's age, so that he can vicariously sort of fix his mistake through parenting her instead of taking the more difficult route. Of course, he's an awful father to her as well. But it's ironic that Yui is the one reprimanding Gendo when she also seeks to escape. Her plan to become a monument for humanity within Unit 1 is also an attempt to chase godhood. She even says herself that it'll be lonely, which really demonstrates how much this plan avoids the difficulty of human interaction. In fact, she straight up rejects returning back to Earth, instead preferring to stay in the Eva. She low-key abandons Shinji the way Gendo does. This might be hard to believe because her plan here goes against her anti-escapist, life-affirming messages, but her desire to be a monument is still antithetical to the story's themes. In fact, in her conversation with Fuyutsuki, she says that the Evas were humanity's attempts at playing God, yet her plan hinges on the Evas. She herself is trying to be God here, and I don't know if she realizes this. It's also important to consider what would happen if her plan succeeded. Humanity would be gone, the solar system would be wiped out, the sun and moon would disappear, but she would remain, stuck in the void. What does that remind you of? Personally, it reminds me of episode 26. when Shinji is in the void, feels free but feels weird, and has it explained to him that he needs other things on Earth to ground him and limit his freedom in order to properly exist, that there needs to be other people so that he can be relative to something. We see a manifestation of this in the very final scene. Shinji is alone on the beach in a way that visually parallels him being in the void, meaning Asuka's presence metaphorically gives him another thing, another person, for him to be relative to and thus affirm his identity. Not only does this parallel reinforce the idea that Yui's plan here is being condemned since it's the opposite of what the series portrays as good, i.e. Asuka's return, but it shows the hollowness of her plan as well. Even if she does succeed, she would just be left floating as a figurative mass of nothingness with no sense of self and nothing to be relative to. Kaoru even says suicide is the ultimate act of freedom, which shows a connection between committing suicide and Shinji's freedom in the void in episode 26. In other words, Yui is essentially chasing suicide here. This hones in on how similar her plan is to human instrumentality on a thematic level. However, I don't think we can fully understand Yui without also understanding Rei's place in the whole thing. Unit 1 and Rei are opposites. Unit 1 has Lilith's body and Yui's soul, whereas Rei has Lilith's soul and Yui's body. Remember that Lilith is the mother of humanity, so both of these entities serve as both Shinji's mother as well as humanity's mother. This shows us that Shinji is supposed to represent humanity. This idea is expressed throughout the show. Kaoru has Adam's soul, meaning he's the ultimate father figure, so it makes sense that Shinji, the guy with parental issues, becomes attracted to Kaoru. Shinji's connection with Kaoru is also what motivates Kaoru to try and preserve humanity. This idea comes to a head when Shinji activates human instrumentality. He now represents humanity on a very literal level because his decisions and feelings are now shaping the fate of everyone. I think this resolves once he ends instrumentality and leaves it up to everyone whether to stay or return to Earth. He is now letting everyone make their own decisions. He is no longer humanity's representative. I'm low-key reaching here, but I think Shinji representing humanity was a very meta way to express the audience self-inserting into Shinji and relating to him. Once Shinji leaves it up to humanity, Ano is now leaving it up to us to learn from the series and work to improve our lives. This goes to show just how short-sighted Yui's whole endeavor is. Shinji already stops being humanity's representative, the series wants to leave it up to us, yet Yui persists in wanting to represent humanity and be everyone's soul monument. This provides a huge contrast between Unit 1 and Rei. Throughout the show, Rei has a whole arc about learning how to be human, how to be like her offspring, but ultimately her nature as a deity catches up to her and she becomes a god by the end of the series. Within this godhood, she still tries to be as human as she possibly can. She helps Shinji because of the connections she made, and as she disperses across time and space, she chooses to remain in her school uniform, almost like she's attached to it because it represents when she learned how to be human. Her exercising her humanity as a god just underlines the tragedy of her arc. Despite her clear desire to be human, despite her having a whole arc learning how to be human, she has to become some weird quantum entity with no sign of her returning back to Earth as a person. While Rei does not want to be God but still becomes one, Unit 1 tries to be God but fails to become one. This frame is really powerful to me because it's like the unwilling God is staring at the failed God. It shows how Yui is misguided and ungrateful in trying to become what is actually a miserable outcome unbeknownst to her. Yui's egocentrism and desire to see God is likely a way to demythologize motherhood. Evangelion is largely about rejecting the comfort of the womb and growing up. Episode 20 has Shinji rejecting his return to his mother in favor of facing the real world. Kaoru is a fatherly/motherly figure who provides unconditional love to Shinji but has to be eliminated. And the end of the series has Shinji separating from Yui, refusing the solace of instrumentality in order to embrace the challenges of a human connection. Asuka strokes Shinji and gives him affection the exact same way his mother did, but this time it is done through a series worth of hardship and work. He won't be getting easy unconditional love from his mom anymore. So to have his mom actually be really weird and crazy and try to become God not only deglorifies her love on a thematic level, but on a literal level, the resulting separation forces Shinji out of the nest. At this point, I think it's quite clear that Yui has a major internal conflict within herself. On the one hand, she's very altruistic and anti-escapist. On the other hand, she is egoistic and pro-escapist. I said earlier in the video that Fuyutsuki represents Yui's ideals, whereas Gendo is opposed to Yui's ideals, and that was somewhat of a lie. Because it's more like they embody different sides of Yui. Fuyutsuki embodies the optimistic side, while Gendo embodies the escapist, god-seeking side. It's ironic because Fuyutsuki was more exposed to her god-seeking side since she explained his plan to him, whereas Gendo was more exposed to her optimistic side when she explained to him that Shinji can find paradise within hell. Despite this, they both eventually ended up with different takeaways and adopted the opposite side of her. For Gendo, this is because of his trauma of losing Yui, which is cool because her attempt to be God unknowingly made him want to become God. For Fuyutsuki, it's because of his more optimistic disposition. After all, he said that Yui's faith in humanity was why she decided to stay in the Eva. While this is true, it's only half the story. She stayed in it for both altruistic and egoistic reasons. In fact, her plan to become God would not work if she was not genuinely optimistic, because if she was wrong about humanity being able to find hope, then Shinji would not have reversed instrumentality and she would have been stuck and unable to go back to the Eva. It's funky because her life-affirming ideology ends up servicing her God-seeking ideology, despite both of these ideas not meshing well. She's incredibly torn, and yet Fuyutsuki focuses more on her altruistic reasons for staying in the Eva rather than her God-seeking ones. It shows that he chooses to follow her because of how her plans benefit humanity, rather than because he's interested in her plan to be a monument. Her separation did not traumatize Fuyutsuki and set him on an egotistical path the way it did for Gendo. Both Gendo and Fuyutsuki were similar in that both of them used to be quite aloof, with Gendo picking fights and Fuyutsuki prioritizing his work over socializing. Yui makes somewhat of a change in both of these people, with Gendo finally being able to connect with someone and Fuyutsuki socializing more. It makes sense that Yui's separation would cause Gendo to relapse and double down on how he used to be, whereas Fuyutsuki stays sane because he was not dependent on her the way Gendo was. Gendo is a mirror of Shinji at the end of the day. Fuyutsuki consistently focused on academia more than human relationships, so it stands to reason that when he's able to bond with someone through academia, he has better exposure than before to the various ways human relationships can manifest and fulfill someone. Fuyutsuki's friendship with Yui gives him more of an appreciation for humanity, but this appreciation is not contingent on the relationship. This is the whole reason why she was able to trust Fuyutsuki with her plan, but couldn't trust Gendo, as he was the kind of person who'd fall off the deep end after she fuses with the Eva. Even though Yui was foolish in trying to represent humanity, she still kind of does in a more symbolic way. While Shinji and Asuka show us the duality in human relationships and how they can foster both cruelty and compassion, Yui demonstrates the two opposite sides of humanity. The arrogant, over-intellectualizing side that wants to become God, and the side that carries unconditional hope, fights for something bigger than ourselves, and is able to see the light in the dark. Thanks for watching.